So these notes that we currently see on the page are currently hard-coded into our notes array in our state. So let's instead grab the notes from our notes collection in our Firestore database and add these notes to the state so that we then see the notes from Firestore displayed on the page. So let's start by just commenting out these notes which are currently in the notes array and save that. And I'll just reload the page and we now don't see any notes. So let's create a new action in our store for getting the notes from Firestore. So I'll create a new action at the top here. We'll call this get notes. And for now, we'll just log out get notes. Let's trigger this action when our app first starts. So let's save that. And let's jump to our root view component, which is app.view in the source folder. So let's open that up. So we'll need to import our notes store. So let's import store notes from @stores/store notes. And then to access the store, we need to assign it to a constant. So I'll just create a comment here which says store. And we'll create a constant called store notes. Set that equal to use store notes, parentheses. And actually this should be use store notes here. So I'll just change that. And let's trigger this new action, get notes, when this view component app.view is mounted. So I'm just going to add another comment here which says mounted. And we'll add an onMounted hook. And we'll need to import onMounted from view. So at the top here, we'll add import curly braces onMounted from view. And now we just want to trigger this action, which we've called get notes. So we can just do store notes dot get notes. And let's save that and see if this action is being triggered. I'll just reload the page. And yeah, we can see get notes being logged out in the console. So let's jump back to our store. And so what we want to do here in this action is grab all of the notes from the notes collection in our Firestore database. So let's jump back to the Firebase docs. On the left here, we're going to go to read data and get data once. And let's scroll down to the example. And actually, let's keep scrolling to get all documents in a collection. So we need to import these two methods from Firebase/Firestore, collection and get docs. So let's just copy this import line and we'll add this to the top of our store. And we'll add this before we import the database. So I'll paste that in there. Again, I'm just going to replace the quotes with single quotes. Let's copy the rest of this example here and paste it into our get notes action. And I'll just stretch this out a bit. And again, I'm just going to remove all of the semicolons and replace the quotes with single quotes. And so what's going on here? Well, this collection method is going to grab the collection specified here in the second parameter from the database, which is specified here in the first parameter. And remember, we're already pulling in our database from the Firebase file we created, and we're calling that constant db. So we can just leave this as it is, db. But we want to grab from the notes collection, because if we jump to our database, we called our collection notes. So let's change this to notes. So this collection method is going to grab the notes collection from the database, and then this get docs method is just going to simply get all of the documents from that collection in the database. So it's going to grab these two documents here. And once that's done, that get docs method, it's going to return a snapshot of the data in that collection and store it in this query snapshot constant. And because this get docs method is asynchronous, you can see the await keyword here. It's going to take a little bit of time. And because we're using await, we will need to make our get notes action asynchronous as well. So we can do that by just adding the async keyword to the start of our action like this. So once this get docs method is complete and it's assigned to this query snapshot constant, it's going to loop through each document in that snapshot and just log out the document ID. So this ID here, and then it's going to log out the document data. So basically any fields which are contained in that particular document. So let's just save this and see what gets logged out. So we'll save that and reload the app. And we can see that it's logging out both of our documents. It's logging out the ID, and then it's logging out an object with all of our fields. And right now our documents only have one field, this content field. So if we look at our notes array in the state, each note just has an ID property and a content property. So we now just need to create an object for each of our notes with these two properties and then push that to this notes array in our state. So let's just set up an object for each note first. I'm going to remove this comment and then I'm going to create a new variable called note. Set that equal to an object and let's add an ID property. And we can see that we can get the document ID at doc.id. So we can just set this to doc.id. And then we need a content property. And this doc.data method will return an object with all of our fields. And we want this content field. So we can just do doc.data parentheses .content. So let's set this content property to doc.data parentheses .content. And now let's just log out this note object to make sure it looks okay. And I'll just remove this console log at the top there and save that and reload. And this looks right. We can see it's logging out an object for each of our notes, and each one has an ID property set to the document ID and the content property set to the content field from the document. So we now just need to push each note object to our notes array, and we should then see the notes displayed on the page. So let's remove this console log here, and instead let's push this note object to our notes array. So to access our notes array in the state, we can just do this .notes. So let's do this .notes, and then we want to push this to the array. So .push parentheses, and I'm going to push this note object. And this is in a for each loop, so it's going to do this for each of the notes which are in the collection in the database. So let's save that and reload. And we can now see our notes on the page, except now they're coming from the notes collection in our Firestore database. One of the best features of Firebase is its real-time data sync capabilities, which means that, for example, if one user is logged into the same account on two different devices and they add a note on one device, they will instantly see the new note added on the other device as well. And likewise, if they edit a note on one device or delete a note, then again, they'll see the change instantly on the other device. However, if we edit one of the notes on our database now, I'll just drag that over here. So if I just edit the content of this note, let's add the word edited at the end and click update. We don't see the change currently on our page. And likewise, if I add a new note, give it an ID of ID3, set the content to added on Firebase, click on save, then again, we don't see that new note added to our view. We'll only see these changes currently if we reload the page. So let's reload the page, and we can now see the new note has been added, and we can see this first note has been edited as well. So let's change our code so that we grab the notes data initially, just like we are now, and display the notes, but so that we also listen out for changes on the database, and when we do receive a change, we update the view in real time. So let's jump back to the documentation. And over on the side here, we're going to go to read data and listen for real-time updates. Then we're going to scroll down to listen to multiple documents in a collection. And this example here is a bit more complicated than we need right now because it's doing some querying, and we will get into querying later on in the course. But for now, let's just copy from this onSnapshot method down to the end. So let's copy that, and I'm going to drag the database back over here, and let's jump back to our get notes action, and we'll paste in this example here, and let's just comment out our previous code. So we're now using this onSnapshot method or hook instead of this getDocs method. So let's just scroll up to our imports and replace getDocs with onSnapshot. And so this onSnapshot method is going to do the same thing initially. It's going to grab a snapshot of all of the documents from the collection that we specify, but it's also going to keep listening so that whenever the documents in the collection change, then this will be fired again. And this means that we can always keep our view up to date. And so we can replace this queue variable here with this collection method that we used before. So let's just copy that from the previous code and paste it over this queue variable. And let's get rid of this cities const and then this log at the bottom. And again, I'm going to remove the semicolons. And so once it's got that snapshot, it's basically doing the same thing as before. It's looping through all of the documents in this query snapshot. And so again, we just want to do the same thing in here, set up a object for each note and then push it to our notes array in the state. So let's just copy our code from the previous code here and just paste that into this for each loop and uncomment that. And hopefully this should be working now. So let's save that and reload the page. And so we can see it's grabbing all of the notes when our app first starts, just like before, but it should also grab all of the notes again whenever there's a change in our collection. So let's just test that out. I'm going to drag the database over here and let's just edit one of our notes here. Just put edited at the end and click on update. And we can see it did grab all of the notes again, and we can see the newly edited note, but we can see all of our notes twice here. And that's because we're pushing all of the new notes to the notes array, but we're not actually clearing it out first, which is why we're seeing two sets of our notes here. So let's just fix that now. So instead of just pushing one note at a time to our notes array in our state, let's set up an array which we can push all of these note objects to, and then just replace the notes array in our state with this notes array that we set up here. So we'll set up an array called notes, set that equal to an array, and then inside the for each loop, after we set up the note object, instead of pushing it to our notes array in the state, we'll just push it to this notes array here. So we can just do notes.push note. And then once this for each is complete, and this notes array here is populated with all of our notes, we'll just completely replace the notes array in our state with this notes array here. So after the for each, we can just do this.notes equals notes. So let's save that and see if that's working. Reload the page. And again, we'll jump back to our database. Let's edit a different note. We saw that change appear instantly. Let's also try deleting a note as well. We can click on these three little dots and click on delete document. Click on delete, and we can see that note is removed from the view instantly. So let's just jump back to our code. One important thing to note is that this onSnapshot hook will keep on running forever until we actually tell it to stop listening, or until we unsubscribe from this onSnapshot method. And this is easy to do. All we need to do is assign this onSnapshot method to a variable or constant, and then fire a method on that constant or variable later on. So we could assign this to a constant called, say, unsubscribe, like that, and then later on, we can just fire a method on this constant. So later on, when we want to stop listening for changes in this collection, we can just do unsubscribe parentheses. Now, we're not going to be doing any unsubscribing just yet, but we will do later on. So I'm just going to remove this for now and remove this unsubscribe constant as well. And another thing to note is that we're currently replacing the entire notes array in our state with the notes from the new snapshot every single time, regardless of the change that was actually made in our collection. So regardless of whether it was a new note that was added or a note that was edited or deleted. So regardless of the change that was made, we're currently firing the same code every time. But if we want to fire different code for different types of changes, so different code for when a note is added or modified or removed, then we can do that. And if you want to learn more about that, then just jump back to the Firebase docs and scroll down to the next example. And we can see an example of that here. And what we can do is fire this snapshot.docChanges method, and this will actually give us the type of change that was made, whether a document was added, modified, or removed. And then we can fire different code according to the change that actually happened on the database. So this is really simple to do. But for now, I'm just going to keep this nice and simple. So before we move on, let's just remove the previous code and save that. Let's add the ability to add a new note to our Firestore database. So a new document to this notes collection. So let's just open up our notes page, which is in source, views, and view notes.view. So currently when the user types something into this text area and clicks on add new note, then this local method is fired, add note, and this then triggers an action in our notes store, this add note action, and it's passing in the value that the user typed in, which is bound to this new note ref. So let's jump to our notes store. So this is the action which is fired, add note. This then receives the new note content as a string. We're then setting up an ID based on the current date and converting that to a string. We're setting up our note object with the ID property and the content property. And then we're adding this note object to our notes array in the state by using unshift. But instead of adding this note object directly to the notes array in our state, let's instead push the note to our notes collection as a document in our Firestore database. And once we do add that new document to our notes collection in our Firestore database, then we should see that appear instantly on our page, because remember we have this on snapshot hook, which is always listening out for changes in that collection and then pulling down those changes, and then we're adding the latest notes to the state. So let's comment out this unshift line and instead add a new document for the note directly to our notes collection in our database. So let's jump back to the documentation site. We're going to go to add and manage data and add data. And we're going to scroll down to set a document. So we can use this setDoc method to add a new document to a collection. And using the setDoc method allows us to specify the ID of the document, which is what we want to do right now because we're currently generating our own IDs based on the current date. However, if we want to add a new document and allow Firebase to auto-generate an ID for us, then we can use a different method instead, which is this addDoc method. But for now, we're going to use this setDoc method and specify our own ID. So we're going to need to import this setDoc method from Firestore. So let's jump back up to the top and add that to our list of imports here. Oh, and we're also going to need this doc method as well. So let's add doc and setDoc. Let's just copy this example here and we'll paste it to the bottom of our add note action. Paste that here. So again, I'm just going to replace all of the double quotes with single quotes. And this is currently going to create a document in a collection called cities. So let's change that to notes. And this third parameter here is the ID that it's going to use. So we can just use this ID that we've set up here. So let's replace this with ID. Just get rid of that semicolon. And then we can just specify the fields for the document here. And we just want to add a content field. And we just want to set that to this string that we're passing into this action here, this new note content. So we can just set that to new note content. And we're no longer using this note object. So let's just comment that out. Let's just save this and see if it's working. So I'll reload the page. Looks like we have an error here, unexpected reserved word. And I think that's because we're using await here, but this function is not set to async. So let's just add a sync, save that again and reload. Let's try and add a new note. Note added straight to Firestore. Click on add note. And we can see the note straight away in our view, because remember we have this on snapshot listener, which is always listening for changes and updating the view. Let's just make sure it's been added to Firestore, and we can see the note here, and we can see the ID based on the current date, and we can see the content property. Now we're currently using the same collection reference in two of our actions here in the get notes action and in the add note action. So let's put this collection ref into a constant so we can reuse it. So I'm just going to copy this collection method here. And at the top here, I'll create a constant called notes collection ref and paste that in. And then I'll copy this constant name and let's replace this collection method here with that constant. And then in our add note action, we can just replace these first two parameters with that collection reference as well. So let's save that, make sure it's still working. Another note added straight to Firestore. And that still seems to be working. Let's just remove all of these comments. And you can see that our notes are not currently being ordered properly based on the date, but we're going to fix that later on. But for now, let's just remove all of the documents from our notes collection which don't have a proper ID based on the date, like these two. So I'm going to click on this one with an ID of ID1, click on these dots and click delete. And then I'm going to do the same thing for this document as well. Delete that. And so currently our new notes are being added to the bottom of the list and not the top. But don't worry, we're going to fix that later on in the order notes by date lecture. Let's add the ability to delete a note from our notes collection in the Firestore database. Now currently, if the user clicks on this delete button in this modal, I'll just jump to components, notes, and modal delete note .view. So when the user clicks on this delete button, we're directly triggering an action in our store, this delete note action, and we're passing in the note ID. So let's jump to our store and this delete note action. So we're passing in the ID, and then we're just using a filter to remove the note with that ID from the notes array in our state. So instead of doing this, let's actually delete the note or the document which has this ID, which is being passed to this action, from the notes collection in our database. So I'm just going to comment out the code in this action. Let's jump to the Firebase docs. And on the left here, we're going to jump to delete data. And we can use this delete doc method to delete a document. So this is nice and simple. We're going to need this delete doc method. We're going to need to import that. So let's jump up to the top and import this delete doc method from Firestore. And let's just copy this code example here. Jump down to our delete note action. I'll paste that there. And we can just replace these first two parameters with our notes collection ref constant. So I'll copy the name of that. Select these first two parameters and paste that in. And this parameter here should be the ID of the document we want to delete. And we're passing in the ID of the document to this action with this ID to delete variable. So let's copy that and just paste that here. I'm going to remove this semicolon and remove this comment. And because we're using await here, because this method is asynchronous, we need to add the async keyword to the start of this action name. So let's save that and see if that's working. Reload the page, and I'll just drag the database over here. And let's click on delete on one of these notes, click on delete, and we can see instantly the note was removed from our notes collection and also removed from our view, because remember we have this on snapshot listener, which is always running, which is going to update the view whenever there's a change. Let's add the ability to update a note on our Firestore database. So currently if the user clicks on edit, they're taken to this edit view. I'm just going to open this up. So views, view, edit note, .view. So when the user makes a change and clicks on save, it's going to trigger this local handle saved clicked method, which is here, which is then going to fire this update note action in our store. And it's going to pass along the note ID, the ID of the note that we want to edit, and it's going to pass in the content of that note. So the content of this text area, which is bound to this note content ref, to this update note action. So let's jump to that. So store notes.js and update note. So this is going to receive the ID of the note and the content of the note, and it's going to find the index of that note in the notes array in the store, and then just simply update the content property of that note with the new content which we're passing in here. So instead of doing this and modifying stuff that's in our state directly, let's just update the note which is in our notes collection instead. So I'm going to jump to the docs. I'm going to jump back to add data. I'm going to scroll down to update a document. And so we can update a document using this update doc method. So we need to import this update doc method from Firestore. So let's do that first. So we'll add that to our very long list of imports here. So update doc. Let's copy this example here. Scroll down to our update note action. I'll comment out the existing code and paste that in here. And instead of using this constant here, I'm just going to copy this doc method and paste that here. And just remove the constant and that comment. Again, I'll remove the semicolon and replace the double quotes with single quotes. And we can replace these first two parameters with our notes collection ref. And this parameter here should be the ID of the document we want to update. And we're passing that ID into this action with this ID parameter. So let's just change that to ID. So this is just going to grab the document with the ID that we're specifying here from the collection we're specifying with this collection ref, and it's going to update the fields of that document as we specify them here. So we want to update the content field, and we want to set it to this content variable which we're passing into this action. So we can just set that to content, and since these names are both the same, we can shorthand this with just content. Okay, so let's save this and remove the old code, and let's see if this is working. I'll just get the database over here, and let's open up one of our documents. Let's edit this one, and we'll fix this typo here. Click on save, and that didn't seem to work. We might just need to reload this. Looks like we have an error. Unexpected reserved word. It's the same issue again. We just need to add a sync to this action. Save that. Reload again. Let's get the database open. So we're going to edit this note here, which we have open here. We'll fix this typo. Click on save. And we can see instantly that note was updated on Firestore. And we also see the change instantly in our view because, again, we have this on Snapshot Listener, which is always running. So a couple of things to note about this update doc method. So currently our documents only have one field, this content field. But when we're using this update doc method, we can pass in as many fields as we want. So let's say we had a username field, we could set that. And if we had a show field, which was a Boolean, we could set that as well. And it would update all of these fields at once. And another important thing to note is that it will only update the fields that we actually specify, and it will ignore any fields which we don't specify. So let's say we were working on a completely different app here, and all of our documents had these three fields: content, username, and show. Well, if we didn't specify the username field and we fire this method, well, that username field on the database will be completely left alone. So it won't be removed from the document, it'll just be completely ignored. But in our app, we're only updating this content field, so let's just remove this field we've added and save that. So by default, when we grab a collection from our Firestore database, the documents will be ordered by the IDs, these IDs here, in ascending order. And because our IDs are based on the date that the note was created, we're currently seeing our notes in ascending order by date. But we want these to be in descending order by date, so that the latest note is always at the top. And we can do this by creating a query and using the order by method. So let's jump back to the docs, and we're going to go to read data and order and limit data. So let's just scroll down to this first example. So we can create a query such as this, pass in our collection ref, and then we can fire this order by method and pass in the name of the field which we want to order by. And we can also pass in a second parameter to this order by method, which we can set to desk to order the documents in descending order. And we can also limit the number of documents we grab from the collection as well if we want to. So in order for this query to work and order our documents by a particular field, we do need a field in our documents which we can order by. And we want to order by the date or the ID, but we don't currently have an ID field in our documents. We only have this content field. So what we need to do is when we add documents to our collection, we need to make sure it also has an ID field set to the date as well so that we can order these documents. So I'm just going to delete the entire notes collection for now by clicking these three dots and delete collection. And we then need to type in the name of the collection and click on delete. And our database is now empty. So let's jump back to our code and we'll jump to our add note action, and we're using this setDoc method to add a new document, and we're currently only adding this content field, but let's also add an ID field as well. So we can just add ID colon and ID because we're setting up the ID here in this variable, and since these two are the same, we can just shorthand this to just ID. So let's save that, jump back to our app and reload, and let's add some notes here, and I'm going to call them first note and second note and third note, just so that we can easily see the ordering of the notes. And if we jump to our database now, we might need to just reload the page there, and we can see all of our documents now have this ID field which is set to the date timestamp, which we're also using for the document IDs here. So we can now order these documents by this field. So let's jump back to our code and we'll jump to our get notes action where we're actually grabbing the notes from the database. And so we're currently passing in this notes collection ref, which we've set up here. But what we can do instead is pass in a query here instead, which has the order by method inside it. So let's jump back to the docs and this second example here, and we need to import some new methods here, query, order by, and limit. So I'm going to copy those and add them to our imports here. And this is all getting a bit long here, so I'm just going to break this up a bit. Maybe we'll have collection and snapshot on one line, and then all of the doc methods on another line, and then these new ones on a third line, just to make this a little bit tidier. Let's copy this query from this second example, and we'll paste this underneath our notes collection ref constant. Let's call this notes collection query, and we want to pass our collection ref as the first parameter. So let's copy this notes collection ref and paste that there. And I'm just going to replace these quotes again with single quotes, get rid of the semicolon. And so we want to order by this ID field. So we want to change this to ID, and we do want it to be in descending order, so we'll leave that as it is. Let's just remove this limit method for now, although I will demonstrate that in a minute. So let's just copy the name of this query, notes collection query, and jump down to this on snapshot method in the get notes action. And instead of passing in our notes collection ref, we'll pass in this query that we've created. So let's save that, and hopefully our notes should be ordered by date in reverse order. Let's just reload the page. And yeah, that seems to be working because from the bottom we can see first note, second note, and third note. And we can also limit the number of documents we grab from the collection by using this limit method. So if we only want to grab 2 documents, we can just add limit parentheses and 2, save that, reload, and we now only see 2 documents. But limiting doesn't really make much sense in this app, so let's just remove that. And let's remove the import as well. And save that, and reload. And we now see all 3 of our notes. We can see in our database now, we're kind of duplicating some data. So we're using this date timestamp for both the document ID and for this ID field as well. And I think it would make more sense when we add a new document to the database to allow Firebase to add one of its own auto-generated IDs for the ID to make sure these IDs are always unique. Because let's say later on, once we've set up authentication and the ability for different users to log in, etc., let's say two different users were logged into the app with the same account, and they both just happen to add a new note at the exact same moment. Well, this ID that we're generating would be the same for both users. And so when those users try to add this note to the database at the same time, one document would overwrite the other document. Whereas if we use Firebase's auto-generated IDs, then this won't be a problem because these IDs will always be unique. And I think it also makes sense for us to rename this ID field to date, since this is really a date and not an ID. So again, let's just delete our notes collection and let's just adjust the way we're structuring our data. So let's jump back to our code and we'll jump to our add note action, and we're currently using this setDoc method to add the new document, which allows us to specify our own ID. But let's instead use the addDoc method, which will allow Firebase to generate its own ID for the document that we're adding. So we'll jump back to the documents, and we're going to go to add and manage data and add data, and we're going to scroll down to add a document, and we can see an example of using the addDoc method in this second example here. So we need to import this addDoc method from Firestore. So let's copy that and we'll add that to our list of imports here. Let's just copy this example, jump down to our add note action, and we'll paste that in here, and we'll remove this const bit, we don't need that. And we can just replace this collection method with our notes collection ref. So I'll copy that from here and just paste that there, and I'll remove this semicolon. And so when we add the document, we want to add our content field just as before, set that to this new note content string, which is being passed into this action. And we also want to add a date field, which is going to be set to this ID variable. And in fact, let's just rename that ID variable to date. So when we add the document, we'll set the date field to date. And because these two names are the same, we can shorthand that to just date. And now let's just remove this setDoc method. And since we're no longer using that, we can remove it from our imports as well. So let's save this and try and add a new note. I'll reload the page and it looks like we have an error. Let's see what's going on here. Unexpected identifier. Let's just click on this store notes thing. Scroll up to our imports. It's because we need a comma here. Save that, reload, and let's add a note, first note. Now we don't see it on the page, but let's see if we can see it in our database. Reload, and we can see it has added the note to the database. We can see Firebase's auto-generated ID there. And we can see the content field and the date field. But why are we not seeing the note on the page? Well, let's jump to our get notes action and we'll log out this query snapshot to see what's going on there. Save that and reload. Open up the console. And we can see the query snapshot here. And we can see this docs array is empty. We should be seeing all of our documents in there. So why is that empty? Well, if we just scroll up to the top, this query that we created here, which is being passed into this onSnapshot method, it's currently trying to order the documents that it grabs by a field called ID in descending order. But we just renamed this field to date, this field here. So we just need to change this to date. I'll just remove this console log, save that, And if we reload, we should see our note. And yeah, we can see our note. And let's just add a couple more notes, make sure the ordering is working. So second note and third note. And yeah, everything seems to be working. And let's just make sure we can still edit and delete. Yeah, edit seems to work, and delete seems to work as well. So we have this date field for each document in our notes collection, and we're using that for ordering our notes. But we're not actually using this date in our app anywhere. So let's use this field to display the date that the note was created over on the left here, in a similar style to the character count, which is over here. But first of all, we need to make sure that we're actually adding this date property to the notes in our notes array in our state, in our store. Because if we jump to View DevTools, so if we click on Store Notes, we can see our notes array here from the state, and we can see our notes currently don't have this date property. They actually have an ID property, which is set to the Firebase generated document ID, which is kind of useless here anyway. Actually, it's not useless because we're using that when we edit notes and delete notes, etc. But we do need to make sure we have that date property as well. So let's jump to our Get Notes action. And when we set up the object for each note, push it to this notes array and then assign that notes array to the notes array in our state. We just need to add the date field as well. So I'll just add a third property here called date and set that to doc.data parentheses .date. So let's save that and reload. And look at our notes array. And we can now see that date property in each of our notes. So let's drag this back over there and close that actually. So let's display the date over on the left here. So we want to jump to this note component in components, notes, and note.view. Scroll up to the template, and we can use Bulmer's column system to lay this out properly. So we have this small tag here, which is spitting out our characters. I'm going to duplicate that, and we'll put the date here in this first one. And to make sure we have the date over here and the character count over on the right, we can use the column system. So this containing div here, we can add a class of columns. And to make sure our columns work on mobile as well and don't stack on mobile, we can add a class of is-mobile. And then we can add a class of column to each of these small tags to make them columns. So class equals column. And this is all documented on the Bulmer site. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. And we currently have this hasTextWrite class on this containing div, but we only want the text for the character length to be aligned to the right. So I'm going to cut this class and instead add it to this second small tag. Save that. And this is looking pretty good. So let's spit out our date here. And we're passing down our note as a prop to this component. So our date should just be at note.date. So we'll do double curly braces, then note.date, save that, reload. And we can see our date on the page, but it doesn't look very pretty in this format. So let's format this sucker so it looks a bit more beautiful and so that it makes sense to human beings as well as robots. And we can actually use View Uses use date format composable to do this. So I'm going to jump to the View Use website and I'll just search for date, and we want to use this use date format composable, and we can see an example of that here. Now this use date format composable was actually added to View Use after I first created this course, so we might need to make sure we have the latest version of View Use. So I'm going to jump to the terminal, kill the dev process with Control and C, and I'm going to run npm uninstall. What is it again? I'll just open up this website in a new tab again and get started. So it's at vueuse/core. So we'll uninstall that, npm uninstall at vueuse/core, and then we'll just install it again by running npm install at vueuse/core. And we should now have the latest version of vueuse. I'm just going to launch my app again with npm run dev. Let's jump back to the use date format page. So we need to import this use date format composable from at vueuse/core. So let's add that to our script section. So I'll add that here. Import use date format from @/vueuse/core. Save that. And to use this to format the date, we can just fire this use date format function, pass in the date we want to format, and then pass in a string with some tokens, which are all explained here, to format the date. So let's create a computed property to format this date. So I'll add a block comment here, which says date formatted. And we'll create a constant called date formatted, set this equal to a computed property. So this use date format function is going to expect a date object, a JavaScript date object, and not a timestamp such as we have like this. So we're going to have to convert this into a proper date object. So I'll create a variable called date, set that equal to new date, and then we'll pass in our date property, which is going to be in this note prop. So props.note.date, and this will convert our timestamp into a proper date object. But because this is currently a string and not an integer, we'll need to convert it to an integer. So I'll just wrap this prop with parse int like that. So we should now have a date object which we can pass into this use date format function. I'm just going to copy this example here. We can just return this. We want to replace use now with this date object we've just set up like that. And hopefully this computed property should be good to go now. So if we scroll up to our template, instead of spitting out note.date, we'll spit out this computed property, which we called date formatted. So date formatted, save that, reload the page. We have an error. Did I forget to launch the app? No. What's going on there? I think I may have imported the composable incorrectly. Import use date format from @/vueuse/core. This should just be @vueuse/core, not @/vueuse/core, because it's looking for our alias there, which is the source folder. So let's save that, reload, and we can see our dates on the page. They're in quotes for some reason. I'm not sure why. Let's put this in a variable. So let formatted date equals, paste that there. Let's log out this variable, save that, reload. Oh, it looks like this use date format is spitting out a reactive data property. So maybe we just need to grab the value from that. So instead of just return formatted date, we'll return formatted date.value. That should hopefully get rid of the quotes. And yeah, those quotes have disappeared. And we can now adjust these tokens here so that we see the date format that we want. So we can use this token reference here. I'm just going to do this US style. So mm-dd for the month and the day, -YYY for the year, YYYY. And I'll get rid of the seconds from the time. Maybe add an @ symbol between the date and the time. Save that. And this is looking pretty good now. And if you wanted to format this date a bit more nicely by spitting out month names and day names and stuff like that, then you might want to use something like datefns or moment.js. Before we move on to authentication and handling multiple users and all that good stuff, let's just add a couple of finishing touches. Now, since the initial loading of our notes is asynchronous, if the user's internet is slow, or if Firebase is slow temporarily for some reason, then the user will be left with a blank screen while they wait for those notes to load. And we can simulate such a delay by using a set timeout. So if we jump to storenotes.js and the getNotes action, before we overwrite the notes in our state with this notes array, which we've populated via Firebase, let's just add a little set timeout of, let's say, 2 seconds. And we'll move that in there. And save that and reload. You can see this doesn't look that great. So let's just add a progress bar to show the user that the notes are loading. And Bulma has a progress bar component that we can use. So I'm going to jump to bulma.io, getting started. And we're going to go to elements and progress bars and indeterminate. And I'm going to use this chunky bottom one here. So I'm just going to copy the last line in this example here. Copy that. We'll jump to our notes view, source, views, and view notes.view. And we'll just stick this before our notes here and save that. And we can now see that on the page. And we don't need the text inside this element, and we don't need this closing tag. So let's get rid of those and make this a self-closing tag and split the attributes on that and save that. Still looks okay. And to make it match our color scheme, I'm going to change this is info class to is success. Save that. And we now have a green progress bar. Now we only want this to be displayed while our notes are loading. So let's jump back to our store file and we'll add a new state property for determining whether or not the notes have been loaded. So we could call this notes loaded. We'll set that to false initially and save that. Now let's only show this progress bar when notes loaded is set to false. So let's jump back to view notes.view and we'll add a v-if directive to this progress element. And I assume we have our store here. Yeah, store notes. So we can just set this to store notes dot notes loaded. Actually, this should be not. Save that. Reload. And yeah, we see the progress bar, but if we set this notes loaded property to true and reload, then we see the progress bar disappear. So let's set this back to false and jump back to view notes.view. And now let's only show our notes if the notes have actually been loaded. And it's a bad practice to add a v-if directive to a component which also has a v-for directive or a v-else directive. So let's instead wrap this note component in a template. Move that note up here and we'll add a v-else directive to this template. So if the notes have not been loaded yet, we display the progress bar. Otherwise, we're going to display our notes. So let's save that. And we now see our notes disappear. And let's jump back to our store and our get notes action. So in this get notes action, before we fire the onSnapshot method, let's make sure that this notes loaded property is set to false. So this dot notes loaded equals false. And then after we've received the snapshot and looped through it and added the new notes to the notes array in the state, we'll set this back to true. So this dot notes loaded equals true. Let's save that and reload. And that seems to be working. We see the progress bar while the notes are loaded, and then we see the progress bar disappear and we see the notes appear. So this looks a lot better now, and we can now remove this set timeout. So let's get rid of that and save, reload. Now most of the time Firebase is so fast that we won't see the progress bar or we won't see it for very long, but it's good to have it there just in case the user has slow internet, or just in case Firebase is slow temporarily for some reason. If we delete all of our notes, I'll just delete them now, then we just see this blank screen. It'd be better to have some kind of placeholder text or something like that to tell the user there are not currently any notes. So let's jump to viewNotes.view, and then after our notes, let's display a div with some text in it, but only if the notes array in our store is empty. So v if store notes.notes.length, actually v if not store notes.notes.length. So in other words, if this notes array in our state is empty, then we're going to display this div. And I'll just put the text no notes here yet. Save that. We can see that on the page, but it doesn't look very good. I'm just going to use some of Bulma's classes to improve the style a bit. So to increase the text size, I'm going to add a class of is-size-4. Save that. And then to make it centered, I'm going to add a class of has-text-centered. Save that. And to give it a gray color, I'm going to add has-text-gray-light. Save that. And then to give it the same font as our logo, I'm going to add is-family-mono space. Save that. And then to add some vertical padding, I'm going to add py-6. Save that. And that's looking a bit better now. And again, all of these classes are documented on the Bulma site. So this placeholder should disappear if we add a note. So let's add some notes. And yeah, the placeholder disappears. And if we delete them all, we see the placeholder reappear. I'm just going to add a couple more notes. In this module, we're going to add authentication to our app so that our users can register, log in, and log out of our app. But before we can set up all that good stuff, then we're going to need a page with a form where our user can register and log in. So let's set up a new route and a new view for that. So let's jump to source and views, and we'll create a new file here called viewauth.view, and we'll add our template tags. And for now, I'll just add a div with a class of auth, and I'll just put auth page in there. Save that. Now let's jump to our router, source, router, index.js, and we'll import our component. I'll just duplicate this one and replace stats with auth. Make sure you replace the file name as well, and we'll add a new route here. So I'll add a comma to the last one and duplicate this. Set the path to /auth, set the name to auth, and set the component to viewauth, and save that. Let's jump to this new page at the path /auth, and we're now on this new auth page. Now I want to use this one page for both registering and logging in as well. So let's add some tabs from Bulma, which we can use to toggle between logging in and registering. So I'll jump to the Bulma site, getting started, components and tabs, and I'll scroll down a bit, and I'll copy this example here with the centered tabs. So I'll copy that, jump back to our new page, viewauth, and we'll paste that in here. Indent it and save that. Let's remove the last two tabs, these LIs. And for the first one, we'll put the text login. And for the second one, we'll put the text register. And save that. So when the user clicks on login or register, we want to toggle between this being the login page or the register page. So let's set up a ref that we can use for toggling these. So let's add the script setup tags. And I'll add a block comment here which says imports, and we'll import the ref method from view. And let's add another block comment which says register/login, and I'll create a constant called register, set that equal to a ref, with an initial value of false. So when this ref is false, then this will be the login page, and when this ref is true, then it will be the register page. And if we jump back up to these tabs, we can see that we can use this is active class to give a tab this active state, which is currently on the login tab. So instead of hard coding this class, let's conditionally add it based on this ref that we've just created. And I'm just going to break this all up a little bit. And I'll split the attributes on this li and remove this class. And instead we'll bind to the class attribute. And we'll add this class is -active, but only when this register ref is false. So if not, register. Let's just copy this opening tag and paste it to the other one. But for this one, we want to add this is active class when register is true. So we can just remove this exclamation mark and save that. And if we change the value of this ref to true, then we now see the register tab has the active state. So let's set that back to false and save that. And now we actually want to change this ref when we click on one of these tabs. So if we click on login, we want to set this ref to false. And if we click on register, we want to set it to true. So let's just add some click handlers to these A tags. So let's add @click. And because this is an A tag, we'll use the prevent modifier. So .prevent to prevent this link from behaving like a link. And when that's clicked, we want to set register to false. So register equals false. And let's just copy this click handler and paste it into the register link. But this time we're going to set register to true. Save that. And we should now be able to toggle between the login state and the register state. So now we're going to need a form with an email field, a password field, and a button so that the user can actually log in or register with an email and password. And let's put this form inside a card component. So we'll jump back to the Bulma site and components and card. And I'm going to scroll down to this simple example here. And I'll copy the code and we'll paste this after this tabs element. Paste that there, indent it, save that. And I want this box to be quite narrow because it's only going to have a couple of simple fields on it. So let's add a class to this card. We could use the class auth-form, save that. And let's add a style section so that we can restrict the width of this card. So style, we're going to target the auth-form class. I'm going to give it a max width of, let's say, 400 pixels. And I want this to be in the center. So to do that, we can just set the margin to 0 on the vertical and auto on the horizontal, which will force it to be in the middle. Okay, let's add a title to this form. So at the top of this card content div, I'm going to add a div with a class of title, which is a class from Bulma, and a class of has-text-centered to center this text. And I'll just put the text login for now. And we see that appear. And I would like this title to change depending on the tab that we're currently viewing. So let's create a computed property to do this for us. So I'll add a block comment which says form title. Create a constant called form title, set that equal to a computed property. And we need to import the computed method from view. So we just want to return some text based on this ref. So what we can do is if register.value is true, I'm going to use a ternary if statement here, then we can return the text register. Otherwise, we'll return the text login. Save that, and we can now use this computed property for this title here. So I'll replace login with double curly braces and form title, save that. And we can now see this title change when we change tabs. Okay, let's add our form now. So we're going to need an email field, a password field, and a button for submitting the form. So let's jump back to the Bulma site and go to form and general. And I'm going to scroll down a bit to this example here with 2 fields. I'm going to copy this code and we'll get rid of this div with a class of content and paste those fields in here. Save that. And actually, I'll just get rid of the top one and just leave this email field. And then we'll duplicate this and change the label in the second one to password. And we'll change the input to a type of password. And we'll change the placeholder text to enter a password. Save. Okay, now we need a button for submitting the form. So let's jump back to the Bulma page that we were just on. And I'm going to jump down to form group. And I'm going to copy this example here with these 2 buttons aligned to the right. So we'll copy that and we'll paste that after this password field. Indent that sucker and save that. And I'll just remove this cancel button. So this p tag with a class of control. Save that so that we just have this submit button. And we could actually use our form title computed property in this button to change the text of the button, just like the title. So let's use that in this submit button here. So form title, save that. And we should now see the text in this button change to login or register. Okay, now let's make this form submittable. And first of all, let's change this login button, this a tag, to a button tag, because we can't submit a form with an a tag, but we can with a button element. And then let's surround all of our fields in a form. So above the email field, I'll add a form, remove the action attribute, and let's move all of these fields and the button inside this form. And let's add a submit handler. So at submit, and we'll add .prevent to prevent the default action of a form, which is to load another page or reload the current page. When this form is submitted, we'll fire a method called onSubmit. And let's create that method. So I'll add a block comment here, which says submit. And let's create this method. So const onSubmit equals an arrow function. And for now, let's just log out form submitted. Make sure that's working. Save that. Open up the console. Click on the submit button. Yeah, we can see form submitted. And now let's set up a reactive object to store the credentials, so the email and the password. And I'll add that after this form title. So another block comment here which says credentials. And we'll create a constant called credentials, set that equal to a reactive object. And we're going to need to import this reactive method from Vue. So let's add that here. And inside this credentials reactive object, we're going to have 2 properties, an email property, which we'll set to an empty string to begin with, and a password property. And we'll also set this to an empty string. So let's save that and we'll bind these 2 properties in our reactive object to these fields on the form. So let's jump up to the email field and split the attributes on this input. And we'll add v-model and set that to credentials.email. And I'll copy this, jump down to the password input, again split the attributes on that, paste in that v-model and change this to credentials.password, save that. And if we put some text in these, we should see these fields update, which we do, so that's all hooked up. Let's set those back to an empty string and save that. And let's add some basic validation to this form. So if the user doesn't fill in the email field or the password field, then we'll just alert an error. So in this onSubmit method, we can just do if not credentials.email or not credentials.password. Then we can alert, please enter an email and password. Gosh darn it. Save that. And so if we click on login, we can see this alert. Or if we only enter an email, we also see the alert. Or if we only enter a password, we also see the alert. Now, if the user passes the validation, so else, then we want to figure out if the user is trying to log in or register, so that we can fire different logic or different actions in our auth store, which we're going to create later on, depending on whether the user is logging in or registering. And we can figure out if the user is trying to log in or register using our register ref. So what we can do here is if register.value is true. So if this ref is set to true and we're seeing the register page, then we want to register the user. So I'll just log out register user with these credentials, and then we'll also just log out our credentials object. Otherwise, else, the user is going to be on the login page and we want to log in the user. So I'll copy this console log and paste it here. And in this log, we want to say login user with these credentials. So let's save that and see if that's working. So we're on the login page. I'll enter an email and a password, click on login, and we can see login user with these credentials, and we see the email and password from the credentials object. But if we're on the register tab and we click the register button, we now see register user with these credentials. And finally, so that the user can log out, let's add a logout button to our header, our navbar at the top here. So our navbar is at components, layout, navbar.view. And you can see this navbar end div, which is adding these links at the end of the navbar, notes and stats. Well, before that, let's add a div with a class of navbar-start, which will allow us to add some links to the start of the navbar. So in there, I'm going to add a button element with a class of button. And I'll just put the text log out, save that. And I'm just going to add some classes to improve this a bit, this button. So we'll add a class of is-small to make it smaller, is-info to give it this nice blue color, a class of mt-3 to nudge it down a bit, and then a class of ml-3 to move it over to the right a little bit. Okay, that looks pretty good. And if we're on mobile, then this logout button will be in the mobile menu. So we now have everything we need in terms of elements to handle authentication. So our users can register, log in, and log out. Okay, let's enable authentication on Firebase and hook our app up to Firebase authentication and create a new Pinia store for handling authentication. So let's jump back to the Firebase console, and we're going to click on authentication and get started. And we can add authentication in a bunch of different ways. So we can allow our users to log in with Google or Facebook or any of these others, or we can just use the good old email and password, which is what we're going to do. So click on email and password, and then click on enable, and then click on save. And we now have email and password authentication enabled for our app. And whenever a user registers with our app, they'll be displayed on this users tab here. And we can also manually create users here as well if we want to. So we now need to hook our app up to Firebase authentication. So I'm going to jump back to the docs site, go to docs and build and authentication. And we're going to go to web and get started. And it shows us how to add the authentication SDK to our app. So we can add this to our Firebase file, which we created earlier. So I'm going to jump to source.js and firebase.js. And we need to import this getAuth method from firebase/auth. Note that this is coming from a different package. It's not coming from the app package or the Firestore package. It's coming from this auth package. So let's copy this import, paste that here, and replace the quotes. And then we can initialize authentication by just firing this getAuth method, passing in our app, and assigning this to a constant. So let's copy this line, paste it underneath this DB line, and we can now use this auth constant to access all of the methods associated with authentication so that we can register users, log them in, log them out, etc. So let's export this constant so we can use it in our stores. So we'll paste that there and save that. Now let's create a new store, a new Pinia store for handling authentication. So I'm going to jump to source and stores, and let's duplicate store notes.js, and we'll call this store auth.js. And I'm going to remove these constants and remove all of the imports except this one at the top, this define store import, which we need. And let's rename this constant here to use store auth. And let's set the ID of the store to store auth. Let's remove everything in the state. Let's collapse these actions and just remove all of the actions. I'm just going to get rid of the getters. I don't think we're going to use any getters in this store. Okay, so now we just need to import this auth constant from this Firebase file so that we can access all of the authentication methods in this store. So let's import auth from @/js/Firebase and save that. And we can now use this auth constant to handle registering, logging in, and logging out users in this store. Let's allow our users to register with our app. So let's jump to our auth page in source, views, and view auth.view. And so if the user is on the register tab and they submit this form, then this onSubmit method will be fired. And assuming they've entered an email and password, then this if statement will fire here. So instead of logging something out here, let's trigger an action in our auth store. So first we're going to need to import our auth store and assign it to a constant. So let's add the import at the top. So import use store auth from @/stores/store auth. And I'll stick a block comment here which just says store. I'll create a constant called store auth. Set that equal to use store auth parentheses. Now let's jump back down to that if statement here. And we'll trigger an action in our store and send along this credentials object which contains the email and password. So we'll do store auth.register user and pass along the credentials object and save that. So now we need to create this action in our store. So let's jump back to store auth.js and let's add an action here. We called it register user, and this is going to expect a credentials object. So let's just log out register user action, and then we'll log out the credentials object as well and make sure that's getting through. So let's save that, open up the console. Oh, my app isn't running right now, so I'm just going to launch that. Oh yeah, it is. Let's reload. Okay, so let's jump to the register tab and enter an email and a password. Click on register, and yeah, we can see register user action being logged out, and we can see the credentials object with the email and the password. So that's all getting through. Okay. So now we need to actually register the user in this action. So let's jump back to the Firebase docs, and I'm going to scroll down to sign up new users. So we can use this create user with email and password method to register a new user. And we're going to need to import this method from Firebase/auth. So let's just copy this import line. And I'll paste this to the top after the Pinia store. We're not going to need getAuth because we're already firing that in our Firebase file. And I'll just change the double quotes to single quotes again. And now let's copy this example here, this create user with email and password method, and we'll paste it into this register user action. I'll just stretch this out a bit, and I'm just going to format this a bit. I'm going to put this dot then onto this line and put this dot catch onto this line, and I'll remove the semicolons and the comments, and I'll remove the semicolons as well. So this create user with email and password method is going to expect 3 parameters: the auth parameter, which we're already pulling in from our Firebase file here, and it's going to expect an email and a password. And we can grab those from this credentials object, which we're passing through, which contains an email property and a password property. So we can just replace email here with credentials.email, and the same for password, credentials.password. And if this registration is successful, then this block will fire, and this user constant will contain some data related to the user that we just registered. And if there's an error, then this catch block will be fired. And if that's the case, let's just log out the error message at error.message. So I'll just log out error.message. Let's save this. Actually, I'll get rid of this console log as well. Let's save this and see if it's working. So I'll jump back to the app, reload, make sure we're on the register tab. Let's just test out the error handling first. And we can test this by only providing a password which is less than 6 characters, because the minimum number of characters allowed for a password on Firebase is 6 characters. So I'm just going to try and register with test@test.com. and the password test, 4 characters. So let's click on register, and we can see the error being logged out. Password should be at least 6 characters. Okay, so let's try and register a real user. And you can use any email address that you want, but I would recommend that you use a person's name in the email address like I'm going to do, because this will make things easier to understand later on when we're dealing with multiple users. So for the email address, I'm going to use jim@test.com, and then for the password I'm going to use test123. So I'll clear the console. So let's click on register. Okay, we're not seeing anything in the console because I forgot to log out this user constant. So let's just log that out and save that and reload. And if we jump to our Firebase console and refresh this users page, we can see it did actually add this new user. But I'm just going to delete that for now and jump back to our app and reload. Click on register and enter the same credentials, jim@test.com and test123. Click on register, and we can see this user constant being logged out. And we can see this contains the user's access token, the user's email address, and the user's unique user ID, and a bunch of other stuff. And this user ID begins with E9J. And if we now jump back to the Firebase console and back to this users page and click on reload, we can see that new user here, and we can see the same user ID here as well. And one thing to note is that when we do register a new user, that user will be automatically logged in, and they will remain logged in until they log out, even if we refresh the browser. So let's give the user the ability to log out next. Okay, let's give our user the ability to log out of the app when they click on this logout button in the navbar. So we're going to jump back to the Firebase docs, and we're going to jump to password authentication, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom. And so signing the user out is nice and simple. We just need to call this sign out method and pass in the auth library that we're pulling in anyway. So let's create a new action in our store which fires this sign out method. But first we need to import this sign out method from firebase/auth. So let's add that here, sign out. And let's just copy this example here. And we'll create a new action called logout user. And we'll paste in that code. And so if the sign out is successful, then this block will be fired. So let's just log out user signed out. And if there's an error, then this catch block will be fired. So let's just log out this error message. Error.message. Okay, let's save that. And now we want to trigger this action when the user clicks on this logout button. And that's in the navbar component. So let's jump to source, components, layout, and navbar. And there's that little sucker there. So let's split the attributes on that. Do we have our store on this component? No, we don't. So let's jump to view auth. And I'm going to copy this constant and the comment there and this import as well. Jump back to navbar.view and just paste that in here. Save that. And what did we call our action? Logout user. So now when the user clicks on this button, we can just add a click handler and trigger store auth.logout user. So let's save that and see if that's working. So we registered a user before, and when we did that, that user was logged in and will remain logged in even if we refresh the browser. So this user is currently logged in and they should be able to log out. So let's click on the logout button and check the console, and we can see user signed out. So we now know that Jim is signed out. Let's allow our users to log in now. So let's jump back to our auth page, view auth.view, scroll down. And so if the user is on the login tab and they fill in an email and password and click login, then this else block will be fired. So let's trigger a new action in our auth store. So we'll do store auth.login user. And again, pass in this credentials object with the email and password. Save that. And let's create this action in our auth store. So I'll create that in between these two actions. So login user, pass in the credentials. And let's log out user logged in. And we'll just log out the credentials object and make sure that's getting through. Save that. Reload. And let's just test that out. Log in. Yeah, we can see user logged in and we can see the credentials object. So now we need a method from Firebase to log the user in. So let's jump back to the docs and we're going to scroll up to sign in a user with an email and a password. So this method works in exactly the same way as this create user with email and password method. And again, we need to import this method, sign in with email and password from Firebase/auth. So let's add that up here. And then copy this sign in with email and password method and paste it into our login user action. And again, I'm just going to format this a bit. I'm going to move up the then block and the catch block, remove all the comments and the semicolons. And again, if this is successful, then this block will be fired and this user constant will contain all of the user's data. So let's log that out. And if there's an error, again, let's just log out the error.message. And let's save that and try it out. So we'll jump back to our app and reload. And just to test out the error check-in, let's try and log in with a user that doesn't exist. So let's try dave@test.com and test123. Click on login. And we have an error here. Email is not defined. Oh, we need to update these parameters that we're passing in here with the email and password from this credentials object. So let's just prepend both of these with credentials dot. So let's save that and try it again. Reload, make sure we're on the login tab, and we'll try and sign in with a user that doesn't exist. So dave@test.com, test123, click login. And yeah, we can see the error, Firebase, user not found. So now let's try and log in with a user that does exist. So jim@test.com. Just going to replace Dave with Jim. Clear the console and click on login. And yeah, that was successful. We can see the user was logged in. We can see this user constant being logged out. And we can see Jim's user ID there. So we now know that Jim is logged in. Now, whenever a user logs in, we're going to need to store some data in our auth store. particularly the user's unique user ID, which you can see here, because later on when we add the ability to handle multiple users, we're going to restructure our Firestore database, and we're going to separate each individual user's data, each user's set of notes, by using their unique ID. So we're going to need to store this user's ID in the state in this auth store. And we could add logic to do that in these register user and login user actions. However, there's a single hook or listener method that we can use, which will listen out for all auth changes. So whether the user logs in, logs out, and this hook will be fired every time the user logs in or logs out. And as I mentioned earlier, once a user logs into a Firebase app, they will remain logged in, even if they close the browser and come back to it. And so this hook that we're going to use will also be fired when a logged in user first comes back to the app or first refreshes the browser, etc. So this hook is going to be a much better place for us to put all of this logic for storing the user ID in our state and all that good stuff. So let's jump back to the Firebase docs, and we're going to go to manage users, and we're going to use this on auth state changed method. So let's import this method from firebase/auth, add it to this list of imports, and let's copy this example here. And we're going to need to trigger this hook when our app first starts. So let's create an action. We could call it init. Let's paste that hook in here. And so this hook will be fired every time the user logs in or logs out, regardless of how they logged in or logged out. So for example, if they logged in just because they previously logged in a previous session and they started the app and got logged in, or if they logged in because they actually logged in with the login form, or if they logged in because they just registered as a new user, then this hook will be fired. And if they did logged in, then we'll have all their user data in this user object. And if instead they logged out, then this else block will be fired. So for now, let's just log out this user object if the user has been logged in. And I'll just put user logged in. And if the user logs out, we'll log out user logged out. And again, we'll log out this user object. And we should see that when the user logs out, that this user object is null. So let's save that, and let's trigger this action when our app first starts. So we could do this in our root component, source app.view. So we could do it when this component is mounted. Now we're currently triggering this get notes action when our app first starts in this app component, but it probably makes more sense to trigger this action on our notes page, because we don't want the app to start getting the notes when they're on the auth page. So I'm just going to copy this mounted hook and this store and the comment, and we'll jump to view notes.view, paste that down here. Actually, let's move the store up to near the top. Oh, we're already importing the notes store here, so we don't need to do that. But we do need to import the onMounted hook here from view. So let's add that here, onMounted, save that, and jump back to app.view. And instead of triggering this get notes action in the notes store, we'll trigger this init action in our auth store. So we're not going to need this notes store here anymore. So I'm going to rename this to useStore auth and store auth. Let's rename these as well. So I'll change store notes to store auth and use store notes to use store auth. Then in this mounted hook, we can just do store auth dot init. So let's save that and see if that's working. Actually, let's jump back to our auth store. And just so we don't get confused with all these different logs, let's comment out all of the logs in our register user, login user, and logout user actions. I'm just doing a multiple selection here and save that. Let's reload the app. And we can see there we reloaded the page, and we've already seen this on auth state changed hook being fired because this user was already logged into the app before we reloaded the page. And we can see the user object being logged out as well, and we can see the user's ID there. So if we now clear the console and click on the logout button, we can see this hook has been fired again because the user logged out, and we can see user logged out, and this user object is now equal to null. So let's just log the user back in again. So I'll log in with jim@test.com and test123. And so when the user logs in, let's store their unique ID. And we'll also store their email address in our store, in our auth store, in our state here. And let's store this in an object in our state. So I'll create a state property called user, and we'll set this to an empty object initially. And then if the user logs in, this onAuth state changed hook will be fired, and this if block will be fired, and we'll have this user object, which we can see being logged out here. And we can get the user's unique ID at user.uid, and we can get their email at user.email. So let's store those in this user object, which we just added to our state. So to access this user object in our state, we can do this .user, and let's add a property to that called ID, and we'll set that equal to this UID, which is coming from this user object. So we'll set that equal to user.uid. Let's also add the email address to this user object as well. So this .user.email equals, and we can grab this from user.email. So user.email. Let's save this and see if this user object in our state is being populated with the user ID and the email. So let's reload the page. I think this user is still logged in. So if we jump to our View DevTools and our auth store, and yeah, we can see the state here. We can see this user object, and we can see it's been populated with this particular user's email address and password. Now, if the user logs out, then we want to remove this information from the state. So if the user logs out, this else block will be fired. So at this point, let's just set this user object in our state back to an empty object. So in this else block, we can just do this .user equals empty object. So save that, reload the app. The user's logged in, and we can see their email and ID in the user object in the state. And if we now click on the logout button, we can see this user property in the state is now set back to an empty object. Let's improve this logout button a little bit. So currently, even if the user is logged out, we can still see this button. But it makes sense to only show this button if the user is logged in. And also it'd be cool if we could display the user's email address in this button as well, so we can see exactly who is logged in. And there's also a little issue on mobile that I want to fix as well. But first of all, let's only show this button if the user is logged in. And if the user is logged in, then this user object in the state of our auth store will have the user's ID property. And if the user is logged out, then it won't have that ID property, and this will just be an empty object. So what we can do is only show that button if that user.id property exists in the state in our auth store. So let's jump to navbar.view and the logout button, which is here. And we already have our auth store available here. So we can just add a v-if directive to this. And we only want to show this button if store auth.user.id exists. So let's save that. And we now see that logout button disappear because this user is logged out. But if we log him back in, so jim@test.com, test123, then we now see that button reappear again. And there's a little issue on mobile with this button. When the button is in this mobile menu, you'll see if I click the button, the user is logged out, but we still see this mobile menu. So let's just fix that. And if we scroll down, we have this show mobile nav ref, which we set up a while back, which will determine whether this mobile menu is shown. So we can just set this back to false after the user clicks the button to hide the mobile nav. So let's jump back to the logout button. And in this click handler, instead of triggering this logout user action in our auth store directly, let's trigger a local method which hides the mobile nav and then triggers this action in the store. So I'm going to cut this and let's trigger a method called logout. and we'll create that down at the bottom. Add a block comment, log out, and set up this method const logout equals an arrow function. And we want to set this show mobile nav ref back to false. So we can do show mobile nav dot value equals false. And then we want to trigger the logout action in our store, which I just cut before. So store auth dot logout user, and we'll need to add parentheses because we're in our script section. So let's save that and see if that works. I'm currently logged out, so let's log in. So jim@test.com, test 1, 2, 3. And if we click on the logout button, we can now see the user is logged out because this user object is an empty object again, and the mobile nav was hidden. And just as one little finishing touch to this logout button, just log in so we can see that. Let's display the user's email address here. And remember, we're going to store the user's email address in this user object in the state in our auth store. And we can see that here in the DevTools. So we can just grab this email address from here. So let's jump back to navbar.view and jump up to the logout button, which is here. And after this logout text, let's add a space, double curly braces, and we'll just spit out store auth.user.email. Save that. And we can now see the email address of the user that's currently logged in this logout button. So currently when the user logs in, I'll just log Jim in, they're left hanging on this auth page. It makes sense after they log in to redirect them to the notes page and not just leave them hanging on the auth page. And likewise, if the user is on the notes page and they log out, it makes sense to redirect them back to the auth page. So let's redirect the user depending on whether they log in or log out. So let's jump to our auth store, store auth.js. Now we can't actually access our Vue router by default in a Pinia store, but we can make the router available in our Pinia stores by using a plugin. And once we've done that, we can access all of the usual Vue router methods such as push and replace within our Pinia store. So let's jump to the Pinia site at pinia.vuejs.org. Get started. We're going to jump to plugins because we're going to create a plugin to make our router available in our Pinia stores. On this page, I'm just going to search for router. And the documentation for this isn't amazing, but I did manage to figure out how to do this based on this little example here. So we're going to add this plugin in our main.js file. So let's open that up. So source and main.js. Let's jump to this example. So currently to initialize Pinia in our Vue app, we're pulling in this create Pinia method from Pinia and just triggering that in this .use method in our create app chain. But what we're going to do instead is assign this create Pinia method to a constant, and then we're going to pass that constant to this use method instead. So we're going to create a constant called Pinia and set that equal to create Pinia. And then in this use method here, we're going to pass in this Pinia constant. And we can now add a plugin to this Pinia instance, which will allow us to add the router to our Pinia stores. So I'm going to copy this bit from the example here, pinia.use. So this is how we add a plugin to our stores. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And what this is going to do is it's going to add a property called router to our root Pinia store, basically all of our stores. And we'll be able to access this new property at this.router in any of our Pinia stores. And it's going to set this to our router, which we're pulling in here. And this mark raw method will basically just make anything we pass into it non-reactive. And since our router doesn't need to be reactive, then it tells us here we should wrap it in this mark raw method. And since we're using this mark raw method, we need to import that from Vue. So let's add that here, mark raw, and save that. And hopefully this should be good to go now. Let's just reload and make sure we don't see any errors. No, can't see any errors. So now if we jump back to our auth store or any of our stores, we should be able to access our router at this.router. And so what we want to do is, if the user logs in, then this if block will be fired. And we're going to add the user data, the email and the ID to this object. And then we want to redirect the user to the notes page so that we're not leaving them hanging on this auth page. So what we can do now is this.router.push, and we're going to push them to the path /, which is where our notes route is. And then if the user logs out, then this else block will be fired. And then we want to redirect them back to the auth page. So we can use this.router, and let's use replace instead of push, so that the user's browser history gets replaced and that they can't go back to where they just came from. And we're going to send them to the path /auth. Save that. Let's see if that's working. So the user is currently logged out, so let's log them in. jim@test.com, test123. And when we click on login, we should be redirected to the notes page. So let's click on login. And yeah, we're redirected to the notes page, and the user has been logged in. We can see this user object has been populated with the email and password. And now hopefully if we log out, we should be redirected back to the auth page again. So let's click on log out. And yeah, the user is logged out, and we're now back on the auth page. Now for now, we do need to manually type /auth in order to get to this auth page. But don't worry, because later on we're going to add some navigation guards to our router, which will automatically redirect the user to the auth page when the app first starts, if the user is not logged in. And we'll do that in the security module. But for now, all of our authentication is set up. So let's figure out how we can really handle multiple users in our app in a way that each user has access to their own individual unique data. Right now in our Firestore database, we basically just have one set of data for one user. We just have this single notes collection at the root of our database, and then within that collection we just have a document for each note. But if we're going to allow multiple users to use our app, where each user has their own individual set of notes, then we're going to need to structure our database differently. Let's just jump back to the authentication page and our users tab. And we can see that each of our users has a unique user ID. And we could use this unique user ID to help us structure our database differently so that each user can have their own set of notes. So let's just copy Jim's unique ID by clicking on this button here. And let's jump back to our database. Now, instead of having this notes collection at the root of our database, we could instead have a collection called users. And then within that collection, we could create a document for each of our users with each user's unique ID for the document ID. And then within each document, we could add a sub collection called notes. And then within that collection, we could add all of our documents for each of that user's notes. So let's just delete our entire notes collection and restructure our database accordingly. So I'm going to click on these three dots and click on delete collection. And then type in notes and click on delete. So at the root of our database, let's create a collection, and we're going to call this users. Let's click on next. And we're going to create a document for each of our users with the document ID set to that user's unique user ID. So let's just paste in the user ID we copied before. And we don't need to add any fields here, just the document ID. So let's just click on save. Now, instead of adding any fields to this document we just created, let's start a sub collection instead by clicking on start collection. And this is where we're going to store this particular user's notes. So let's create a collection called notes and click on next. Now let's add a couple of documents here for a couple of notes. So for the ID, I'm going to click on auto ID, and then for the content field, I'll just add the text Jim's first note. Then I'm going to click on add field and add a date field, because remember all of our notes have a content field and a date field. And then I'm just going to use the console to generate a date timestamp. So I'm just going to type in date.now parentheses and hit enter and copy this date and paste it in here. Click on save, So this user now has a notes sub-collection with one document inside it. So let's add another document for a second note as well. So let's click on Add Document, and again, Auto ID. And for the content field, I'll put Jim's second note, and then we'll add a date field. And again, I'll jump to the console, type in date.now and hit enter, and copy this date timestamp and paste it in here and click on save. Okay, let's close this console and just quickly go over the structure of our database. So at the root of our database, we have a collection called users, and within that, we're going to have a document for each user with the document ID set to the user ID. And then within this document, we're going to add a notes collection. And within that, we're going to have a bunch of documents for each of that particular user's notes. So let's jump back to our app now. I'll just reload to make sure this is still running. Let's log in with Jim. Jim@test.com, test123. Now we can't see any notes right now. And this is because if we jump to our notes store in stores, store notes.js, we're setting up our collection ref here. And this is just looking for a collection called notes at the root of our database. But we no longer have a collection called notes at the root of our database. We now have this users collection, then we have the user's ID, and then we have the notes collection within that. So let's adjust this notes collection ref so that it points down to this notes collection here. And we can basically just pass in our path down to this sub collection, one parameter at a time. So we can just pass in users and then this ID and then notes. So let's jump to this notes collection ref, and we can just pass in, first of all, the database and then users. And then as the second parameter, we're going to use this user ID. So I'll just paste that from my clipboard. And then for the third parameter, we can pass in this notes collection. Let's save this and see if we can see Jim's notes. Let's reload the page. And we can now see Jim's notes that we just added before. Jim's first note and Jim's second note. Let's just make sure we can still add, edit, and delete. So let's add a note called Jim's third note. Click on add, and that's been added. Now let's edit that. Jim's third note edited. Click save. Let's see if we can see that in the database now. And yeah, we can now see 3 notes in our collection. And here's the one we just added. Let's just make sure we can delete a note. And yeah, we can delete a note and we can see it's removed from the database as well. If we take a look at our notes collection ref, which we just changed before, we're currently hard coding this user's unique user ID into this collection ref. But if we're going to allow multiple users to use this app, then we need to be able to update this unique user ID with the unique user ID of any user which logs into the app. So that if, let's say, Jim logs out and Steve logs in, Steve can see Steve's notes, which will be at users, and then Steve's ID, and then notes, and not Jim's notes, which will be at users, and then Jim's unique ID, and then notes. And if we just jump back to our auth store, storeauth.js, remember that whenever a user logs in, which is being handled here, we're going to add that user's unique ID to this user property in our state in this auth store at user.id. So when the user logs in and their ID is added to this user object, we can grab that ID when the user hits the notes page from the auth store and add it to our collection ref here. But first, let's create a new action in our notes store where we can initialize this ref with the user ID of the user that just logged in. So we'll jump down to our actions and let's create a new action called init. And so what we're going to do here is initialize our database refs, and then we're going to trigger this get notes action to actually get that user's notes. So we can just do this .get notes. So let's save that. Now when our user hits the notes page, let's trigger this action instead of this get notes action. So let's jump to the notes page, source, views, and view notes.view, and scroll down. So on the mounted hook of this page, we're currently triggering the get notes action But let's instead trigger the init action that we just created and save that. Now let's jump back to our notes store, storenotes.js, and scroll up to our refs, well, our ref and our query. And I'm just going to stretch this out a bit. And instead of assigning to these constants here, let's change these to variables and initialize them as null initially. And then in our new init action, we'll set up our ref and our query and assign them to these variables at that point. So I'm just going to copy both of these and paste them into this init action and get rid of the const keywords and jump back to the top and remove the assignment from both of these constants and change these to variables instead of constants. Let's scroll down to our init action. So what we want to do here in this init action is grab the user ID of the currently logged in user from our auth store, which remember will be at user.id. And then we can just add it to this database ref here so that this database ref will be pointing to the currently logged in user's notes instead of just Jim's notes collection. So what we need to do is import our auth store into this store. So let's add that here. So import use store auth from @stores/store auth. And to use this store, just like in our components, we need to assign it to a constant or variable. And you might think we could just do this at the top here. So const store auth equals use store auth. But it sometimes doesn't work when we do this right at the top level because this store isn't ready yet. So what we want to do is actually do this in our action instead. So we'll do that inside this init action. Okay, so we now have access to the auth store here with this constant. And so the logged in user's user ID is going to be at storeauth.user.id. So let's replace this hard-coded user ID with storeauth.user.id. Let's save this and see if it's working. So I'll jump back to the app and reload, and it doesn't seem to be working. We have an error here, cannot read properties of undefined. So let's just log out this user ID here and see if that's getting through. So we'll log out storeauth.user.id, save that and reload. And we can see here that storeauth.user.id is undefined. And I think this is happening because we're trying to grab this user ID from the auth store before that user has actually been fully logged in and before this user object in the state of our auth store has been populated with that user's user ID. So what we could do is, instead of firing this init action in our notes store on our view notes page in the mounted hook, which we're doing here, what we could do instead is trigger this action when we know that the user has been logged in. So in this onAuth state changed hook at this point here, right after we populate this user object in the state with the user's ID. So let's just jump back to view notes.view and get rid of this mounted hook and also remove the import of onMounted and save that. And let's instead trigger this init action in our notes store in our auth store after the user has been logged out here. So we're going to need to import the notes store into this auth store. So let's add that here. Import use store notes from @stores/store notes. And to access the store, we need to assign it to a constant or variable. So let's do that at the top of this init action. Const store notes equals use store notes parentheses. And after the user has been logged in and we've added their ID and email to this user object and we've pushed them to the notes page, let's then trigger the init action on our notes store. So we can just do store notes dot init parentheses. So let's see if this is working now. Reload the page And yeah, it's working. We can see Jim's notes because we're currently logged in as Jim. And we can also see Jim's user ID being logged out. So before we move on, let's just remove this console log from the notes store. And that's here. And save that. Let's make sure our app is going to work with multiple users. But first of all, let's jump to our View DevTools and take a look at the notes in our notes store. So I'll click on this arrow and then View. And we can see our store notes here, and we can see our notes array. And now if we log Jim out, we can see Jim's notes are still in the notes array in the state. And if we actually jump to the notes page, we can still see them on the page. And by the way, later on, we're going to prevent our users who are not logged in from even getting to this page. But still, I think it's a good idea when a user logs out to clear the notes in the state so that a different user can never see that user's notes. So let's jump to our notes store, storenotes.js, and we'll create a new action for clearing out the notes array in the state. And I'll create this after the get notes action. So we'll call this clear notes. And all we want to do here is set this notes array in our state back to an empty array. So we can just do this .notes equals empty array. So let's save that. And now let's jump to our auth store, storeauth.js. And when the user logs out, this onAuth state change hook will be fired. And the user object here will be null. So this else block will be fired. And we then empty out the user object and we redirect the user to the auth page. And after that, let's trigger this action in our notes store, which we just created, clear notes, to clear out the notes in the state. And we already have access to our notes store with this constant here. So we can just do store notes.clear notes. Let's save that and see if it's working. So we're logged out and our notes array is currently empty. So let's log in with Jim. And we can see the notes array in the notes store populated with Jim's notes. So let's log this sucker out. And yeah, that's worked. The notes array is empty again. And if we do jump to the notes page, we can't see any notes there. Okay, let's register a new user to make sure that multiple users can use this app on the same browser or on multiple browsers or devices. So I'm going to create a new user, click on the register tab. And for the email address, I'm going to use steve@test.com, but you can use whatever you like. And the password again, test123. And we're now logged in with our new user, steve@test.com. And if we jump to our authentication page, we can now see Steve on this list as well. And we can see Steve's unique user ID there as well. So let's make sure Steve can add, edit, and delete notes. So we'll add Steve's first note, Steve's second note, and Steve's third note. And seems to be working. Let's delete a note and let's edit a note as well. Steve's second note edited. Click on save and it seems to be working. Let's jump to our database. And we can now see Steve's user ID here in this document in our users collection. And then we can see Steve's notes here. Okay, let's jump back to our app and we'll sign out Steve and log back in with Jim. And we now see Jim's notes. And let's log Jim out and log back in with Steve. And this seems to be working with multiple users. Well, let's just see what happens if we open up a different browser now. So I'm going to open up Safari, copy this link from the address bar. And let's log in with Jim. So Jim@test.com, test123. And we're seeing Jim's notes. So let's add a new note for Jim, Jim's third note. And we see the note was added correctly. on this browser. But if we look at Chrome, where we were logged in as Steve, we're now seeing Jim's notes. So why is this happening? Well, if we just jump back to our code and we jump to our notes store and this get notes action, as I mentioned earlier, this onSnapshot hook will keep on running and keep on listening forever until we tell it to stop listening or until we unsubscribe from this listener. So on Chrome, when we first logged in with Jim was logged in and this onSnapshot listener was set up for Jim, and that listener just kept on listening. So even when we logged Jim out, this listener for Jim's data was still listening. So then we logged in with Steve and a second listener for Steve was set up for Steve. Well, that initial listener which we set up for Jim was still running in the background. So that's why when we went to Safari and logged in with Jim and added a new note for Jim, that first listener that we set up on Chrome for Jim was still running. So when we added the new note on Safari, that initial onSnapshot listener was fired and it then grabbed all of Jim's data, even though we're logged in with Steve. So what we need to do here is unsubscribe from this onSnapshot listener every time a new user logs in. Or we could unsubscribe from it every time a user logs out. But it's going to be easier for us to do this whenever a user logs in. So I briefly showed you earlier on how we can unsubscribe from an onSnapshot listener. So all we need to do is assign this onSnapshot method to a variable and then call a method on that variable later on to unsubscribe. So we could assign this onSnapshot listener to a variable called, let's say, get notes snapshot, like this, and then later on, we can just call a method on this variable to unsubscribe. So get notes snapshot parentheses. And this will unsubscribe and stop this listener from doing its thing. So what we could do is make this variable a global variable, which we set to null initially. So I'm going to copy this variable name, and then up near the top here, I'm going to add let get notes snapshot equals null. We can then remove the let keyword because we're going to assign this onSnapshot listener to this global variable we just set up here. And I'm just going to remove this, which we just added at the bottom there. And so what we can do now is, before we actually set up this onSnapshot listener and assign it to this global variable, we can check whether there's anything in this variable, i.e. if there's already an onSnapshot listener assigned to that variable. And if so, trigger a method on this variable to unsubscribe from that listener. Because when we call a method on this variable and unsubscribe, then this variable will then be equal to null. So what we can do here is if get notes snapshot, as in if there's already an onSnapshot listener assigned to this variable, then we can just call a method on this variable to unsubscribe. Get notes snapshot parentheses. And I'll just add a comment here to make it a bit more clear what's going on here, because it's not entirely obvious. So unsubscribe from any active listener. Okay, so just to go over what's happening here, we've set up this global variable get note snapshot, which is set to null initially. Then let's say a user logs into the app for the first time, and it's the first time anybody's used the app on that browser or device. Then this get notes action will be fired. And then in this if statement, we're going to see if there's anything in this variable, and this will be set to null initially on that first session. So this will be ignored. Then we're going to set up a snapshot listener for that user, and we're going to assign it to this variable, get notes snapshot. And let's say that user then logs out and a different user logs in, then this get notes action will be fired again. And then when we hit this if statement, there will be an onSnapshot listener assigned to this variable, and we want to get rid of that. So then we're going to trigger a method on that variable to unsubscribe from that listener which was set up by the previous user, or possibly by the same user who logged out and then logged back in again. So we're going to unsubscribe from that listener from the previous session and then set up a new one, and then again assign it to this variable. So let's just make sure this is working. I'm going to save that, and on Safari I'm just going to log out and quit the browser, and I'll log out on Chrome as well and just reload the page. Okay, so let's log in with Jim. So we've set up this listener for Jim, and we can see Jim's notes. Now if we log out Jim and log in with Steve, click login. So this get notes action is going to be fired, and this variable will still have an onSnapshot listener from Jim's session. So hopefully we're going to unsubscribe by firing a method on this variable. And then we're going to set up a new listener for Steve's data and assign it to the same variable. And we can see Steve's notes here. So just to make sure that we did properly unsubscribe from Jim's session, let's open up Safari again and copy the address from the address bar, and let's log in with Jim. And we see Jim's notes. So let's add a new note here, Jim's 4th note. Click on add. And we see Jim's note added, but on the browser that Steve's logged into, we're still only seeing Steve's data. And let's add a note for Steve as well. Steve's 3rd note. And it all seems to be working. So each user can only ever see their data, their list of notes, and never anybody else's notes. And let's just make sure it's working with a single user using the app on 2 different browsers or 2 different devices. So let's log out Jim on this browser and we'll log in with Steve. And hopefully if we add a note on this browser, we should see it pop up on the other browser. So Steve's 4th note. And yeah, we saw that appear instantly on Chrome. Now let's edit this on Chrome. Steve's 4th note edited. And we should see it change on Safari. Click save. And yeah, we saw that update straight away. And finally, let's just delete a note on Safari. And yeah, we see that note deleted on Chrome. And everything seems to be working properly. So we can log in different users on the same browser or device without seeing any issues. And we can also log in one user on multiple devices without any issues. In this module, we're going to finish off our app by adding some security. First by adding some navigation guards, and then by adding some Firebase security rules to make sure that only authenticated users can access the data in the database, and also to make sure that each individual user can only access their data and not the data of any other users. And once our app's security is nice and solid, we're going to build it for production and host it using Firebase hosting so that we can share our app with anybody. Let's start by adding some navigation guards. So what is a navigation guard? Well, right now, if our user is logged out, I'll just log out Steve. Even if the user is logged out, they can still get to the notes page where they're left with an empty screen. And really, if the user is logged out, we don't want them to be able to get to any page in our app besides this auth page. And likewise, if the user is logged in, I'll just log in Steve. When a user is logged in, they can still get to the auth page. And really, if a user is logged in, we don't want them to be able to get to this page. And so we can use navigation guards to fix these problems. Navigation guards allow us to hook into our router, and as the user tries to navigate from one route to another route, we can either allow them to get to the route that they're trying to get to, or we can stop them from getting to that route and redirect them somewhere else, depending on certain criteria. So let's jump to the View Router website. I'll just Google View Router, jump to the website and get started. And then we're going to jump down to navigation guards. And we're going to be using a global navigation guard, this before each hook. So this hook will be fired every time the user tries to navigate to a route. And in this hook, we can see where the user is trying to get to with this to parameter. And we can see where the user came from with this from parameter. And then we can make some sort of check, such as whether the user is authenticated. And then based on that check, we can tell the router where to send the user by just returning an object with a name property set to the name of the route that we want to send them to. So let's copy this example here. And we'll open up our router file, which is in source, router, and index.js. And we'll add this navigation guard here after this const where we set up the router. And for now, let's remove everything inside this hook and we'll just log out this to parameter and see what gets spit out. And I'll just add a comment here which says navigation guards and save that. And if we jump back to our app and open up the console, we can see this to property being logged out when we first reload our app. And this is an object with a bunch of different properties for the route that the user just went to. So we can see the path of the route and the name of the route, as in these names which are specified here in our routes array. And so if I just clear the console and we jump to, say, the stats page, again, we can see this logged out again. But this time it contains data related to our stats route. So this hook will be fired every time the user tries to go to a new route. So if the user is not logged in, like this user, and they try to get anywhere besides this auth page, for example, the notes page, then we want to prevent them from getting to that notes page and redirect them back to this auth page. And if we jump to our auth store, in source, stores, and store auth.js. When our user logs in, we add the user's ID to this user object in our state. So we can tell if the user is logged in by seeing if this ID property exists in this user object in the state of our auth store. So let's jump back to our router file index.js and import the auth store. So let's jump up to the top. And let's import our store here. So import use store auth from @/stores/store auth. And let's jump back down to our hook, our before each hook, and assign our store to a constant so that we can access it. So const store auth equals use store auth parentheses. So if the user is not logged in, there will be no ID property in this user object in our auth state. So what we can do is if not store auth.user.id. So in other words, if the user is not logged in. And we also want to check if the user is trying to get anywhere besides the auth page. And if we just jump to our console, we can see in this to object, this contains a name property, which is set to the name of the route that the user is trying to get to. This name here that we've specified in our routes. So we want to make sure this name property in this to object is not equal to auth. So what we can do here is add another condition to this if statement. So if to.name is not equal to auth. So in other words, if the user is not logged in, and they're trying to get somewhere other than the auth route, then we're going to redirect them back to the auth route. Oops, I have too many equals symbols there. So we can now just return an object with a name property, which is set to the name of the route that we want to send the user to. And we want to send them to the auth route. So we can just do return, then an object and a name property, and we can just set this to auth. So let's save that and see if it's working. So this user is not logged in, and if we try to get to the notes page, it won't let us get there. And likewise, if we try to get to the stats page, it won't let us get there. It's redirecting us straight back to the auth page. Now, if the user is logged in and they try to get to the auth page, then we want to prevent that. So what we could do is just prevent the user from leaving the current route that they're on. So let's jump back to our before each hook, and we'll add another if statement here. So if the user is logged in, then there will be this ID property in this user object in the auth store. So we can do if store auth.user.id if the user is logged in. And then we want to check if they're trying to get to the auth page. So we can do and to.name is equal to auth. So if the user is logged in and they're trying to get to the auth page, then we can just prevent them from getting to the auth page. Now we could just redirect them back to the notes page by returning an object with a name property set to notes, which is the name of our notes route, which we can see here. However, the user might be on the stats page when they try to access the auth page. So I think a better approach would be to just stop the user from leaving the route that they're currently on. And if we want to do that, then we can just return false, like this. So let's save that and see if that's working. I'll reload. So we're currently on the notes page, and if we try to jump to the auth page, it won't let us. It just leaves us on the route that we're currently on. And likewise, if we're on the stats page and we try to get to the auth page, again, it will prevent us from getting to the auth page and just leave us on the stats page. Let's make our Firestore database more secure with some security rules. So let's jump to the Firebase console and Firestore database and rules. So when we first created this database, we set it up in test mode. And this means that our database is completely insecure. It means that absolutely anybody can read or write to any place in our database, regardless of whether that user is authenticated, as long as that read or write request was made before this date here. So for me, that's the 29th of June. And so this is not good. And just to demonstrate how insecure this database is, let's show how one of our users can read and edit another user's data. So let's jump to our app and we'll log out Steve and we'll log in with Jim. Jim at test.com, test 1, 2, 3. So we're currently logged in with Jim and we're seeing Jim's data. So let's jump back to the console and we'll jump to authentication and we'll grab Steve's user ID. So the other user's user ID. So I'll copy that and let's jump to our notes store. So source, stores and store notes.js. And we'll jump down to this init action where we're setting up the database ref to tell our app where to read and write the data from. So this ref is pointing to the users collection and then the currently logged in user's user ID and then this notes subcollection. So let's duplicate this line and comment out the first one. And instead of grabbing this user ID from the auth store, let's hard code in Steve's user ID, which we just copied from Firebase. So we're logged in with Jim, but we're pointing this ref to Steve's data. So let's save that and reload. And even though we're logged in with Jim, we can see Steve's data and we can also edit it as well. So Steve's third note edited by Jim, save that. So obviously this is not very good at all. We need to add some Firebase security rules so that Jim can only ever read and edit Jim's notes and Steve can only ever read or edit Steve's notes. So let's jump back to the Firebase console and back to Firestore database and rules. And let's just briefly explain what's going on here. So this is the Cloud Firestore service. Then we're grabbing any documents inside our database. Then we're matching any one of our documents. And then we're allowing anyone to read or write to that document as long as their read or write request was made before this date here. Now we don't want this in a real world app we want to make sure that only authenticated users can read or write to our database, and also that each individual user can only read from and write to their own individual set of notes, their own individual documents. So let's just click on data. So in other words, this user with this ID here should only be able to read or write to documents or collections which are underneath this document here. And likewise, this user with this ID should only be able to write to or read from documents which sit within this document here. Okay, so let's add a rule so that the user with this user ID here can only read from and write to documents underneath this document, and likewise the user with this ID can only read from and write to documents underneath this document. So I'm just going to open up the rules tab in another tab, and I'll drag the database over here. So let's comment out these 4 lines here. We can just select those, and on a Mac press Command and slash, although it might be Control and slash on Windows, I'm not quite sure. Let's add a different rule. So if we want to match requests to this users collection at the root of our database, we can just add match /users/. And if we want to match requests to one of these documents within that users collection, well, these IDs are always going to be unique. So we need to use a placeholder in our path here. So to add a placeholder to our path, we can just use curly braces. We can give this a name, any name we want. So I'm just going to use user ID, and this placeholder will allow us to access this particular user ID within the logic of our match statement. And this will become clear in a minute. So underneath this path, we want to match any document under that path. And we can match any document by using this placeholder here, which was in the old set of rules. So I'll copy that and just add slash and paste that in. So let's say the user tries to read a document at the path users/this user ID /notes, and then a document within that notes collection. Then that's going to trigger this match statement, and then we're going to have access to this ID here, this part of the path that the user is trying to access using this user ID variable here. So what we can do here is add some curly braces, and we can allow the user to read or write to this location based on some condition. So we can just add allow read, write, if, and then some condition. Now every request made by a user will pass along this request object that we can see being used here. And in this request object, there will be an auth object. And within that auth object, there will be a UID property, which will give us the unique user ID of the user who is trying to make this request. So what we can do here is allow the user to read and write at this location if request.auth.uid is equal to this user ID in the path that they're trying to access. So we can do if request.auth.uid is equal to this user ID placeholder that we're using here, user ID. And we just want to finish this off with a semicolon. Okay, so let's just go over what's happening here. So let's say a user tries to write a document underneath the path users and then this ID here. Well, that request is going to be caught by this match statement, and then we're going to allow that request, whether it's a read request or a write request, but only if the user ID of the person who is trying to make that request is equal to this ID here. So in other words, only if that user is trying to write to their own individual set of data. So let's publish that and see if this is working. We can just click on publish, and let's jump back to our app. So we're currently logged in as Jim, but because we hard-coded Steve's user ID into our path in this ref, we're currently displaying the other user's notes, Steve's notes. But if we reload the page now, we can now no longer see Steve's notes. And if we look in the console, we can see an error here, error in snapshot listener, missing or insufficient permissions. So Jim is now no longer able to access Steve's notes. Now this error is not currently being caught properly, so let's just catch this error properly. So what we can do is jump to our get notes action in the notes store, and this on snapshot listener, we can just add another function to this method as a third parameter. So we can just add an arrow function here, so error, and add an arrow function, and then we can just log out error.message and save that. We can see that error is being caught properly now. So let's jump back to our init action and remove this hard-coded ID and uncomment the old line, which is actually grabbing the currently logged in user's user ID from the auth store, and save that. And let's make sure Jim can still access and edit Jim's notes. So let's reload the page. And yeah, we're logged in with Jim and we can still see Jim's notes. Let's just make sure we can still edit. Yeah, we can still edit and we can still delete. However, Jim can now never access or edit or delete any other user's data. And we now know that our database is secure. Okay, so our Noteballs app is good to go now. We've hooked it up to Firebase. We've set up authentication so our users can register, log in and log out. We've made our app work with multiple users and multiple sets of data. And we've secured our app with navigation guards and Firebase security rules. So to finish up, let's build this sucker for production and get it hosted using Firebase hosting so that we can share our finished app with others. So first of all, let's build our app for production. So let's kill our dev process. And if we look at our package.json file, we can see that we can build our app for production using this build script. So we can just run npm run build. And that's finished, and it's added our production app to this new dist folder. And we can see all of the assets there. So let's host this app using Firebase hosting. So let's jump back to the Firebase console and we'll click on hosting, get started. And so it says we need to install the Firebase CLI globally in order to host our app. So let's copy this command and jump back to the terminal and run that command. And that's finished installing. So let's jump back to Firebase and click on next. And it tells us we need to log in the terminal using this Firebase login command. And then we need to run Firebase init to initiate our project. So let's run Firebase login. And it looks like we have an error here. DNS.setDefaultResultOrder is not a function. And if you see this error, it's because you need to update Node to the latest version. Now, if you installed Node on the Node website, nodejs.org, then you can just download the one on the left here and install that, and you should be good to go. But if, like me, you're using NVM to manage different versions of Node, then you can just run nvm install and then the version number of the latest version. So 16.15.1 at this moment in time. So 16.15.1. But since I already have this version of Node installed, I can just run nvm use 16.15.1 to install that version. However, it looks like I don't actually have it installed, so I'm going to run nvm install 16.15.1. And it says I'm now using that version. So I'm going to run that Firebase command again, Firebase login, and see if it works now. And it says I'm already logged in. However, if you're not logged in, then it should show a pop-up in your browser, which allows you to log into Google. And once you sign in on that pop-up, it should tell you that you're logged in the terminal. Okay, so let's jump back to Firebase and run the next command. Firebase init. And we just want to initialize hosting here. So we want to use the arrow keys to select hosting, press space to select that and hit enter. Then we're going to choose use an existing project. And we want to select our Firebase project from this list. So I'm going to select this Noteballs project. Now it says, what do you want to use as your public directory? Well, we want to set it to this dist folder where our finished app is. So we want to type in dist, hit enter. And when it says configure as a single page app, we want to choose no to this because although our app is a single page app, we already have all of our routing being handled by Vue. So we don't need Firebase to add any other URL rewriting or anything like that. So let's choose no to that and hit enter. Set up automatic builds and deploys with GitHub. This will basically allow you to connect your Firebase hosting project to a Git repository so that when you push new changes to that GitHub repository, it will be picked up by Firebase and automatically redeployed. So feel free to set that up if you like, but I'm just going to choose no to that. Keep this simple for now. And when it says dist/index.html already exists, overwrite, you definitely want to choose no to that. Otherwise, it will totally mess up our project. And it says Firebase initialization complete. Let's jump back to the Firebase page and click on next. And to deploy this sucker, we can just run Firebase deploy. So let's try that. Firebase deploy, hit enter. And that's finished deploying, and it gives us a URL where we can view our finished app. So let's command and click on that. And we see our app live on the internet. So let's log in with one of our users, jim@test.com, test123. And it's allowed us to log in and we can see Jim's notes. So let's just make sure it's all working. So Jim's fourth note. And it looks like we have a problem here. This button is not being enabled when we type something in here. Let's have a look in the console and we can see an error. Model value is not defined. So let's fix this in the next video. But let's see if we can edit a note. Jim's third note edited. And again, we see this same error being fired every time we type into this text area. So there's something going on with this text area. So we can't add a note and we can't edit a note. Let's see if we can delete a note. Yeah, so we can still delete a note. Well, there's something funky going on with this text area. So let's fix that in the next video. So whenever we type into this text area, we see this model value is not defined issue. And we see that on the notes page and on the edit page as well. So both these pages are using a shared component, which is in source, components, notes, and add edit note.view. And the issue is with this text area here. And I managed to figure out that this is something to do with the fact that we have this V model on the text area set to the special model value prop, which is being passed down, which means that this text area will two-way bind with this model value prop, which is being passed down to this component. And we also have this input event, which will be triggered every time a character is typed into this text area, which then emits the update model value event to the current value of model value. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but it seems to be something to do with the fact that these two are both trying to update the model value and they're somehow clashing. Now, why this error only happens in production and not in dev, I don't know. And I wasn't able to figure out exactly why. But I did manage to figure out something that seems to work. So what we can do is change this vModel directive and instead just bind it to the value of the text area like this. So this means that we're only binding to the model value prop one way. And then in this input event, when we emit the update model value event, instead of passing along the value of the model value prop, what we can do instead is grab the actual value from the text area element itself by tapping into the event object. So what we can do here is replace model value with $event.target.value. So let's save this and build it for production again and redeploy it and see if it's working. So first we want to build it with npm run build. And that's finished. And now we want to deploy it with Firebase deploy. And that's finished deploying. So let's see if it's working now. I'll reload the app and it's already logged us in. And let's type a new note into this field. And we're no longer seeing that error and we can see the button is enabled. And let's click on that. And we can now add a new note with no issues. And let's just check we can edit a note. Save that. And that seems to be working as well. And let's see if we can delete a note. Okay, good. So let's see if we can log out and log in with a different account. So steve@test.com, test 1, 2, 3. And yeah, we're logged in with Steve and we can see Steve's notes. Let's just make sure we can edit and add a new note. And delete a note. And yeah, that seems to be working. Let's see if we can have the same user logged into the same account on different devices. So I'll open up Safari and log in with Steve. And we can see Steve's notes. Let's add a new one. Steve's 4th note. And yeah, we see that appear on the other browser. Let's try and edit it over here. Edit it on Chrome. Save that. And yeah, we see the change on Safari straight away. Let's try deleting a note on Safari. And yeah, we see that note removed on Chrome. So our finished and hosted app now seems to be working properly. Congratulations, you made it to the end. I hope you now feel ready to start building your own apps with Vue 3 and the incredible Composition API. I also hope this course has helped you to understand the massive benefits that come with the Composition API over the Options API. Make sure you retain the knowledge from this course by building apps with the Composition API as soon as you can. You could try rebuilding the Noteballs app from scratch on your own, or you could try building a clone of one of your favorite apps. And if you want to learn more from me, then jump on over to dannys.link/YouTube, where you can find my YouTube channel, Make Apps with Danny, where I share tons of free content on Vue.js, Quasar Framework, Vuetify, and VS Code, and much more. Also, check out my other premium courses at dannys.link/courses. And all of the links to my premium courses on this page will automatically apply my special discount to each course. So I have a course on Vuetify, which is the most popular component framework for Vue.js. Unfortunately, at the time I'm recording this, Vuetify doesn't support Vue 3, but hopefully it will soon. And then I have 3 courses on Quasar Framework, which is an absolutely incredible framework which allows you to create a Vue.js app with a single code base and deploy it to many different platforms. So you can deploy it to a real app that can be deployed to the app stores for iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. You can deploy it to a single page application, a progressive web app, a server-side rendered app, and even to a browser extension for Chrome or Firefox. And the latest version of Quasar does support Vue 3 and the Composition API. However, at the time I'm recording this, these courses are for Vue 2 and the Options API. However, with all of the skills that you've learned in this course, you should be able to follow along with these courses using Vue 3 and the Composition API. And finally, I have a short course where I teach you the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'll attach links to my YouTube channel and courses page to this lecture. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy building stuff with the Composition API.